Hey, so a while back I watched this movie called The Lovely Bones. It came out in 2009. I'm pretty sure I watched it around 2014 or something like that. And I really loved it. And I could never find it anywhere else again, but I adored this movie. Recently, I figured out that it was actually based on a book of the same name by Alice Sebold, and I have it right here. The book was written in 2002, and they say that the book is always better than the movie, and that is completely true. The book was phenomenal. In this book, Susie Salmon, who's the main character, gets murdered by a man in her neighborhood, and she spends the entire novel trying to get people to see that he's the one that did it, and she also spends the entire novel trying to let go of her family and let go of Earth, as many people are trying to tell her up in her heaven. Her family's trying to let go of her at the same time, and they get separated. There's a lot of turmoil within the family because of what George Harvey had done to them. Eventually, the entire family grows up without Susie. She realizes that they don't need her anymore, so she leaves and goes to a more permanent heaven. And at the end, George Harvey eventually gets his just reward and he dies. Moving on, the book starts off in a small town in Pennsylvania in the year 1973, and it continues till 1984. And it starts off in a small home where the main character, Susie Salmon, lives with her family. The first chapter explains how Susie is murdered by a man in her neighborhood named George Harvey. As the first chapter progresses, it is explained there's also a middle school of sorts where Susie goes to school, and a cornfield that Susie crosses to go to and from school. After the first chapter, much of the story continues on Earth, but a large part of it is spent in Susie's heaven, which she describes as the high school that she always wanted to go to. She also describes that much of everyone else's own heaven, it's whatever they wanted most or whatever they craved in their actual lives on Earth. What's interesting about the cornfield that I mentioned earlier is that she only spends the first chapter, because it's the only part of the book where she's actually alive, in this cornfield. And there's lots of other chapters. I think there's 24 other chapters in this book, but it is the most important setting or place throughout the entire novel. She's murdered there, and every time it's mentioned in the book, the police find a new piece of evidence, or her family starts suspecting more and more of George Harvey, and they start to zero in on him as a suspect in their own minds. One article of clothing that she wore, I guess it's not really an article of clothing, it's a bracelet that she wore, and it's got a bunch of charms on it, so it's a charm bracelet. But her favorite one was the Pennsylvania Keystone charm, and her killer, George Harvey, actually ripped off this charm and kept it, and he threw away the rest of her charm bracelet into a man-made lake. The charm specifically is the main focus of a lot of the most important parts, or a lot of the most riveting parts of the entire novel. Now that I talked about where the story takes place, I'm going to talk about who the story is about and who it centers around. So obviously the main character, Susie Salmon, is in her perspective, so it's going to more or less center around the people that she cared about, or the people she wants to know about, as she watches them from heaven. She focuses more on her family and her killer. She wants to make sure that her family figured out who her killer is, and she wants to make sure that her killer never gets away with what he did to her. She starts out in the novel as sort of angry and upset at her killer, which any person should be. The guy just killed you. Why are you not upset? She could be more upset, which I personally think that's what she should be. She's not as upset as what I would be if I was killed by some random dude. She misses her family a lot. She tries to live the rest of her life in heaven through them by constantly watching them, as I said. She also meets a lot of people in her heaven, a girl named Holly specifically, and another woman by the name of Franny, who she sees as a sort of motherly figure after she's left Earth. It is later revealed that these two girls were also murdered by George Harvey, which gives them another emotional connection. She meets a whole bunch of other girls that he actually had murdered earlier. There was a lot. He killed a woman in 1960, a few years apart after that, the oldest being 49, I'm pretty sure. She was his landlord, and he had killed her after raping her. The youngest was 6. The range is pretty wide in there, but it's mostly teens or young girls. Most of the time he rapes and then kills. Sometimes he'll just kill them. It's explained in more detail in the book, and it's kind of a sad topic to talk about. Near the end of the book, she actually realizes by keeping all this angry energy inside of her, it's doing more harm than good, as she is projecting her feelings onto her family and causing them to act out. For example, she projects her anger onto her dad for George Harvey, and he ends up trying to kill him, but doesn't. He ends up in the hospital from getting beat up by another kid. She finally realizes that she needs to accept the fact that she's dead and let go of her family on Earth. By finally letting go, they're able to come back together and start making new lives for themselves. And this happens around 1984, which is like 11 years after she dies, I'm pretty sure. At the end of the book, she joins the other girls that have been murdered by him, and they all go to a sort of permanent heaven where they can live. I honestly believe that Alice Sebold wanted her readers to be able to connect with Susie. She's actually really relatable. She's in her teens, she has a crush, she trusts someone in her neighborhood, which she shouldn't have, and she loves her family a lot. As a teenager, reading this novel actually made me feel like I was reading a diary. It's so in-depth, and it really focuses on the emotions of Susie. I related to it a lot, and a lot of the problems that Susie was facing or complaining about, like the stuff she was studying in school. Alice Sebold really wanted the readers to think of Susie as an uplifting girl, as someone that's a very powerful and independent young woman. The main conflict of this novel is that George Harvey, her killer, is fleeing from the small town because Susie's sister had finally figured out that he was a killer. She had found the notebook of all his other kills in his house, and she had taken it to the police. The police can't seem to find him or catch him. I don't know why. He just seems to be one step ahead of them at all times. Susie ends up following him while she's in heaven, and she explains that if she were to commit perfect murder, she would use an icicle because the murder weapon melts away, and she talks about this a lot while she's in heaven because it's a game that they play. She notices that George Harvey has stopped somewhere and he's next to a deep ravine, and as it would be, icicles are hanging over his head. She makes an icicle fall, which makes him fall into the ravine to his death. George Harvey dying ultimately solves the conflict of him running away and not being responsible for her murder because he's dead, so he can't commit any more murders. Alice Sebold's theme is that good things happen because of tragedies. Sebold proves in the novel that tragedies and miracles go hand in hand. You cannot have one without the other. The entire book is a tragedy, and only at the end does Susie realize that there are so many good things that happened, but only because she was no longer there.